Welcome to the Joshua Ngoma podcast for spiritual inspiration and Africa's strategy positioning in global politics.
Africa's rebirth. The story of Africa's rebirth or renaissance is as old as the continent itself. From its ancient civilization to slavery, colonization, political independence, democracy, and now the quest for economic freedom under globalization. At various levels, Africa has tried to reinvent herself with varying degrees of success and mixed results. Africans are a resilient people. Over the ages, they have exhibited a fighting spirit and resistance demonstrated by Africa's forerunners throughout the 14 generations of institutionalized slavery, a century of colonization, apartheid, and a dismal 60-year post-independence performance. This is evidence enough that Africans have always been an assertive people in their pursuit to break loose from bondage and chart a new journey for their own continent. Here lays Africa's paradox that her people and their descendants have individually achieved and reached almost every echelon of success possible. But collectively, Africa's more than 1 billion people still lag behind on the global economic ladder in comparison to other regions of the world. African nationalism, a worldwide pan-African movement led by the likes of Marcus Garvey, inspired African nationalism. Garvey was a Jamaican-born, powerful Black revolutionary and race leader. His mission was the emancipation of all people of African ancestry all over the world. Garvey asked, quote, "Where is the Black man's government? Where is the king and kingdom? Where is his president, his country, and his ambassador, his army, his navy, his men of big affairs? How will help make them?" End quote. Since 70 years ago, all of Africa gained political independence from colonial rule, with the last milestone being that of South Africa's independence from apartheid in 1994. The euphoria, promise, and high expectations that came with independence were understandable. Unfortunately, 70 years on, most of these dreams remain largely unfulfilled. On the continent of Africa, young nationalist leaders emerged and demanded human justice and the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms for all through independence from colonial and imperial rule imposed by Western occupation. The most notable were Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Patrice Lumumba of Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Kenneth David Kaunda of Zambia, Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Kamuzu Banda of Malawi, Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya, Sokature of Guinea, Leopold Senghor of Senegal, Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe of Nigeria, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo of South Africa. The vision and aspirations of Africa's founding leaders were predicated upon political and economic independence and unity of the whole continent as one entity. This vision for a new Africa is best embodied in the words of Kwame Nkrumah, called the ideology of a new Africa, or commonly dubbed as Nkrumahism, which states, quote, "Nkrumahism is the ideology for the new Africa, independent and absolutely free from imperialism, organized on a continental scale, founded upon the conception of one and united Africa, drawing its strength from modern science and technology, and from the traditional African belief that the free development of each is conditioned by the free development of all. Ghana became the first African state to gain its independence from the British on March 6, 1957, and its success caused a domino effect on many other African states that also gained theirs in the 1960s. Nkrumah and other African leaders were in a hurry to improve the living conditions of their fellow nationals. However, they were to learn fast that while they had attained political independence, their economies were still under colonial control, a phenomenon known as neocolonialism. They flew a new flag and sang a new national anthem, but the instruments of wealth were still securely firm in imperial hands. In order to redress this condition, many African governments nationalized privately owned industries and firms and turned them into state-owned enterprises. At the time, this was seen as the surest and fastest way of freeing their economies from imperial control. Without economic empowerment, political independence for African nations was a mere symbolism without any tangible substance. This urgency for economic progress was met with wrong priorities on the most part. On the other hand, these were leaders who were in a hurry to improve the living standards of their people, but had no precedents to follow. Wrong policy choices led to most independent states to declare one-party systems of government, with their leaders becoming life presidents. These leaders were expected to serve as long as they were alive. They were thus intolerant to opposition views, and political opponents ended up in jail, more often than not without due process of the law. These faulted economic paths ushered in stagnation and retrogression in some instances. These conditions culminated in political instability as citizens became disillusioned and resulted in military coups d'etats across the breadth and width of the continent. These military coups took away the gains of independence. In fact, during the last 70 years or so, over 70 coups d'etats have happened in 26 countries in Africa. Notably, 16 out of the 26 countries where these coups have taken place are in Francophone Africa. Perhaps what has been even more tragic is that the founding nationalists' original vision and intent of the United Africa as one entity has either been compromised or entirely lost with time. They envisioned Africa's development as based on modern science and technology, and nations that looked out for one another as a brother's keeper. At the turn of independence in Africa, the Cold War between the Western and the Eastern blocs was at its peak, and the newly independent African nations were forced to make a choice, either to declare allegiance to the East or to the West. Colonization was perpetuated mainly by the Western countries. At independence, most African countries gravitated towards the Eastern Bloc of nations. The continent at the time, on the most part, belonged to the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM, under the former African Organization of African Unity, AOU. But individual countries had loyalties divided along the Cold War lines. The Cold War divide lasted only until the Communist Eastern Bloc of Nations Union crumbled, symbolically ending with the collapse of the Berlin Wall that divided Western and Eastern Germany. With the end of the Cold War, Africa's hopes as a result of dependence on the Eastern Bloc were dashed. The next phase of the African Renaissance happened almost immediately in the post-Cold War era. This period was marked by a new international order dictated by the dominance of multilateral organizations in the affairs of recipient African countries. Therein entered multilateral lenders, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF. The African leaders subjected their economies to structural adjustment programs, SAPs, prescribed by the multilateral institutions. Under extremely stringent measures, a one-size-fits-all economic remedy was the prescription to reverse and correct structural deficiencies in African economies. The Structural Adjustment Program was meant for African governments to downsize their civil service, cut subsidies to local farmers, education, health, and transportation. The impact of the removal of subsidies was almost immediate. Stable food prices spiked as the output of farmers began to fall due to a high cost of inputs due to removal of subsidies, leading to food shortages. Retrenchment packages of laid-off civil servants ran out, and the high cost of living made it hard for the citizens to access basic services such as education for their children, healthcare, and infrastructural facilities. From independence, most African countries had adopted socialist philosophies of governance, and development models were tailored after the Eastern Bloc, with centralized economic planning and power concentration. On the flip side, SAPs were Western-style economic systems. SAPs required devolution of power from the center and the release of innovative energies of the people to achieve their utmost potential. In spite of best intentions, most of the implementers were lost in the new environment. They were trying to develop a new model and culture of business. By the same token, the people and the policies were intended appeared to be confused with the process and the goals of the program. Further, the structure adjustment programs were not properly thought through, and their management lacked expertise and the technical know-how. The impact on citizens was negative. For instance, most civil servants who had used their retrenchment packages to start their own businesses crashed. They neither had the mindset or nor experience in private sector management and in the dictates of a competitive free market. These conditions resulted in unrest all around and became the festering ground for the perpetuation of military governments through coup d'etats. Many countries of Africa had now turned to constitutional rule and holding elections and respecting the results in ways that had been certified as free and fair by the international community. Africa's statesmen had gone a step further by taking their own initiative in resolving raging conflicts in countries such as Kenya, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and turning them around into viable functioning states. The former Secretary General of the United Nations, in the person of Kofi Annan, a native of Ghana, was exemplary in this regard. A modern leadership for Africa. At this present stage, the wheels of fortune for a modern leadership are slowly but surely tilting in the right direction. Africa's new breed of leadership is not shackled to the past, yet it has a deep sense of history and appreciation of the rough journey of its people. This modern leadership is forward-looking, focused on securing a better future for its citizens and the quest for self-reliance, relevance, and competitiveness. Africa's modern leadership has a clear understanding of the nuances and complexities of globalization. It is determined to establish and project a positive identity of the continent as an equal partner in the community of nations. This new leadership holds its own on the international scene by demanding that Africa is treated fairly and by making sure that the continent gets what rightly accrues to her. Africa is a magnet and a hive of activity for billions of dollars in foreign investment, meant for the extraction of the vast wealth of raw materials that sustain the growth and viability of the global economy. As a consequence, Africa today is being courted vigorously by emerging economies like China, and the other traditional partners in the West are also intensifying their competitiveness. Africa must ensure that no longer must its leaders succumb to trading partners unless on equity terms. They need Africa's natural resources to develop their economies, and the Africans need the right price so they can develop their own also. None of our cooperating partners and investors seeking our resources does it just for the love of Africa. To the contrary, they are coming for their financial benefits. It is the solemn duty of African leaders to ensure that the interests of the continent are upheld and Africans also get what is rightly due to them. Under colonial rule, Africa has had the experience of selling its resources for a nickel and a dime. The experience of the colonial era should serve as precedence and a guide to make us arrive and demand better terms for the good of our people. Globalization should work to our advantage as well. Information and its proliferation are now readily and cheaply available. That should help us not to be found wanting in any area of negotiation skills or prudent decision making. In this way, we can guarantee our development and also win the respect of the rest of the world. Africa's modern and future leaders are better educated, democratic, respect and adhere to the rule of law. They also understand that integrity matters. They accept the verdict of the people through the ballot box and step aside to make room for others when they lose or have served the maximum prescribed terms of office. The era of former African leaders fleeing their nations to seek refuge abroad for fear of persecution at home or perpetual unwarranted litigation for abuse of office or looting of public coffers is fast becoming the trend of the past. Instead, these former leaders continue to be relevant think tanks, advisors, and envoys, and they mediate national and regional conflicts. For instance, former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, has established the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Former President of Nigeria, General Olusegun Obasanjo, has started an ultra-modern library complex. It is a center for acquisition of knowledge and skills development for youth in Africa. Former President of Ghana, John A. Kufuor's Foundation of Leadership, Governance and Development in Accra, Ghana, is a work in progress. Africa's new leaders are not vouchers that prey on national coffers for personal gain and that of their families and political cronies. They ensure that the wealth of the nation goes to the fullest benefit of the people. The wealth of the nation ought to be used in expanding quality educational facilities at all levels, making quality health readily accessible to all, and eradicating preventable diseases like malaria, cholera, and by building good infrastructure systems that alleviate the plight of our people, especially in the rural areas, providing good drinkable water and sanitation as the logistical framework for development. What is the vision for this new Africa? Africa's modern leadership has also set out the blueprint for the continent's success and sustenance by understanding that Africa needs to put together as one entity and economic bloc. They first changed and replaced the Organization of African Unity, OAU, which had become antiquated on the most part. It had met its major goals, which were to rid the continent of the remaining vestiges of colonization and apartheid, promote unity and solidarity among the African states, coordinate and intensify cooperation for development, safeguard the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states. The OAU served the continent well, but Africa's new frontier of challenges has changed. They need a renewed vision that was potent enough to confront more and more complex challenges in the advent of globalization. The OAU was replaced by the African Union, AU, out of which the new Partnership for Africa's Development, NEPAD, was formed. NEPAD is an African Union strategic framework for Pan-African socio-economic development. It gives both the vision and the policy framework for Africa's development strategy in the 21st century. NEPAD's primary objectives are to eradicate poverty, place African countries, both individually and collectively, on a path of sustainable growth and development, halt the marginalization of Africa in the globalization process, and enhance its full and beneficial integration into the global economy, accelerate the empowerment of women. The AU also established the African Peer Review Mechanism, APRM, voluntarily adopted by the member states of the African Union to promote and reinforce high standards of governance. The peer review mechanism is a self-monitoring mechanism to ensure that the policies and practices of participating states conform to the agreed political, economic, and corporate governance values, codes, and standards contained in the Declaration of Democracy, Political, Economic, and Corporate Governance. Its primary purpose is to foster the implementation of policies, standards, and policies that lead to political stability, high economic growth, sustainable development, and accelerated sub-regional and continental economic integration through sharing of experiences and reinforcement of successful and best practice, including identifying deficiencies and assessing the needs of capacity building. This clearly written statement of vision is yet another testament to Africa's determination to chart its own course of development by meeting internationally accepted principles and governance. Thank you for listening and watching. Until next time. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Joshua Ngoma podcast. Bye for now until next time.